Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Gabriel Yurden, and I'm a project specialist here at the New York State Tug Hill Commission. Tonight, we're going to present the first of our four-part Tug Hill Winter Wildlife webinar series, and tonight's webinar will focus on Fisher. I'll go ahead and explain the logistics of the webinar and introduce the Tug Hill Commission before your speaker for tonight from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation will take over. So to explain a little bit about the New York State Tug Hill Commission, for those of you who aren't familiar, the commission is a small, non-regulatory state agency charged with helping local governments and citizens shape the future of the Tug Hill region. The Tug Hill region includes 41 towns and 18 villages in portions of Jefferson, Lewis, Oneida, and Oswego counties. The uniqueness of the Tug Hill region and its natural resources were recognized by New York State in 1972 when it created the commission. In 1992, the state legislature passed the Tug Hill Reserve Act, further recognizing the statewide importance of the region's natural resources. Through public meetings and surveys, local people have repeatedly told the commission they want to maintain what they treasure most about the Tug Hill region, which is clean water, healthy forests, productive farms, stable communities, and opportunities for hunting, fishing, and recreation. You may not know, but the Tug Hill region is larger than both the state of Delaware and Rhode Island, and it encompasses 2,100 square miles with a 275 square mile densely forested core forest region. So it's in support of the natural resources of the Tug Hill that its residents and the Tug Hill Commission support and treasure that we are presenting this wildlife webinar series. With that, I'll introduce your speaker for tonight. Tim Pyszczynski graduated with a bachelor's degree in wildlife management from SUNY Cobleskill in 2012 and has been employed by the New York State DEC Department of Wildlife for just under 10 years, 7 as a regional fur bearer biologist. And apart from the New York State DEC, he's worked as a wildlife technician in various locations across the country for other universities, state agencies, and consulting companies. Under these positions, he has collected data with various methods for a number of different game and non-game species. For tonight, feel free, and we encourage you to put questions in the chat, and we'll take a couple of breaks throughout the webinar for Tim to answer your questions. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar as well. And this recording will also be posted on YouTube and on our website afterwards if any of your friends and family weren't able to join us tonight. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tim.
To do what they have to do, or throughout their life history. On the right hand side of this page, I have tracks of Fisher. So right now we're getting some snow. Some of us spend a lot of time outside in the woods seeing different tracks. To me, obviously seeing it many times and tracking these animals throughout the woods, their tracks stand out real easily. But something to look for when you're walking about, like all mustelid species, like the river otter, the mink, the weasel, they all kind of hop along. So you'll see how it kind of looks like two, two, two. When you see that in the woods, you're like, all right, well, it's either a mink, it's a fisher, or an otter. If you track it long enough, an otter is going to go into the water. A mink is going to be a little bit smaller and eventually go in the water. And fisher, contrary to their name, they're like cats. They don't want to touch water if they don't have to. Will they? Yeah, there's been videos of them swimming, and they cross rivers. We've tracked them across the Salmon River, but generally they want to stay out of the water. So if you see that in the woods, that track pattern of 2, 2, 2, there's a good chance that it's a fisher. So history in New York, and also touch on, throughout the presentation, this is, look at Fisher in the Northeast, but I'm going to try to tailor it towards the Tug Hill. And reason being is for 4 years, from 2018, 19, 20, and 21, we did a lot of research on Fisher in the Tug Hill. So a lot of the information that I have that I'm presenting to you is information that we have just collected all right here on the Tug Hill area. But our history in New York, like most species, when colonists were coming over for England, we see this huge change in overall landscape. A lot of the forests that were here prior to that time were, cut, put ablaze for small agricultural purposes. I'm sure you're all aware. You walk across the Tug Hill or parts of the Adirondacks. You can't go anywhere really without finding a stone wall, an old foundation. So the habitat was significantly altered, and for the fishers' sake, not in benefit to them. In addition, in that period, there was no regulated season for trapping or hunting of these species, so people could just go and take what they wanted. And you're all aware, or some of you may not be aware, but our country was founded on the fur trade. People are coming over here trying to get beaver pelts to sell back overseas. And the result of that was loss of a lot of wildlife species in the Northeast. So fisher declines. There was once elk in New York State that were no longer here. The wolves, the cougars, those two species, there was actually bounties placed on them around the turn of the century, in addition to wolverine. So there was a lot of species that river otter, we'll put that in the mix, that were here and then are gone. And now fisher coming back, really great. River otter coming back, the success story. As a result of regulated harvest and also this changing in habitat. All of those farms that we once saw, those small, kind of subsistence farms that were on the Tug Hill, they no longer are there. And there's remnants of them, but where they were is all trees, which now favors the fisher. But at that time in 1842, almost all fisher in New York State were confined to the Adirondacks. Current wildlife management practices really started around the turn of the century, thanks to Theodore Roosevelt, and protection of a lot of our species really didn't start off until the mid 1936 and 1948. You see there was a trap enclosure. That regulated harvest really didn't start about until that time. But as we're going through history, we closed some trapping seasons. We have a little bit more protection for these species. Can't really say the habitat's changing just yet, but it's on its way. We are able to have a restricted harvest in 1949 with some successive closures in 1977, 1983, and 1984. And if you look at the harvest data from that time period, season closure was usually immediately after a season where the harvest really dropped. So if the harvest was, say 200 animals, and then it dropped to 100 animals, they closed the season the next year because they were just concerned of why that could be. Was it over harvest or what was going on? And it's hard to say at that time period what it was. But some of the stuff that I'll explain, maybe it had something to do with the habitat that was out there or the prey base or something that wasn't really necessarily correlated with the overall population of say per se fisher. But and like anything, throughout the 70s, 80s, and even going on into the 2000s, we knew these animals were once in New York State and not doing so good, and we put on a lot of reintroduction programs. One with the otter, that happened as early as the late or early 2000s, really through 1990 through 98, 99, 2000, where otter were captured from the Adirondacks and put in Western New York. And now we know that as a success. There's otter pretty much everywhere. The same with fisher. Fisher were taking out of the Adirondacks and put in the Catskill Mountains. And soon after that, there was able, enough animals to justify a limited season right in 1985 after the reintroductions between 1970 and 1980. And then just most recently with the expansion of the fisher population across all of New York State, coming from the Catskills to the west and from northern part of Pennsylvania up into New York. Based off of the research that I'll talk about a little bit, we were able to justify opening up a limited harvest in Western New York. So a lot of history with fisher in New York State. Right now, currently, their populations is probably as strong as they've ever been in the last 250, 300 years. All right. So now habitat. What is a fisher's habitat? Why are they doing so good on the Tug Hill? I'm going to first draw our attention to the photo on the left-hand side that kind of oversees a wetland with some conifers, mixed hardwood forest. This photo was taken out of a plane while we were tracking fisher as part of our project. And fisher, generally speaking, they prefer habitats that have at least 40% canopy cover. They don't like open field areas, and that's because they're denning in trees. And that picture on the right-hand side, that's a female carrying its young of the year up a tree into its den. So they rely heavily on these large diameter-based trees that have cavities that will offer protection from predators and also the weather. In addition to that, if you're looking at that picture on the left, you'll notice this wetland complex. That wetland complex, you can kind of point out some beaver dams in that as well. That creates excellent habitat for everything, but also fisher. Some of the diet stuff I'll get into in a couple slides, you'll see that fisher, they prey on everything. And those wetland habitats, they provide cover. Usually the edges of them are laced with conifers, whether they're firs or spruce or hemlock. And then that associated wetland is just pumping out frogs and snakes, small mammals, voles, mice, squirrels, which is excellent for fisher. I mean, they're kind of a opportunistic feeder. They're going to get anything they can get their mouths onto, but those habitats are very important to the species. So you can see how that beaver, that if those beaver happen to not dam that up, which it would be more of a linear stream, that linear stream probably wouldn't provide as much forage to the fisher and everything else if it wasn't there. Also in this picture, I'll point out I don't know if folks can see my cursor, but my cursor goes to like an opening area where there's a house. Though fisher really prefer that canopy cover, our research has found that they do the best in this wild urban interface where these large tracts of woodlands meets where we start to get some fragmentation, because that fragmentation is providing edge habitat for other small mammals that then thrive in that environment and in turn becomes food for the fisher. And like most species, the healthier the females are, the more kits they're going to have, the more successful they're going to be. So fisher love forests. Maybe they really actually like that interface where there's some fragmentation to allow some growth of regeneration that favors these other species, but more or less need the woods. The diet. The diet is fun for the fisher because if you look below here, I have a list of animals that we had found in the stomachs of fisher. So how did we get stomachs of fisher? we have a regulated harvest of Fisher throughout New York State. And in a period from 2018, 19, 20, and 21, while we were doing our Fisher research on the Tug Hill, we were also requiring trappers to turn in skulls. And we also voluntarily took Fisher stomachs and other parts of their bodies that we could use to test for a whole host of different things. But the stomachs and their contents were shipped on to the Finger Lakes Community College, where they then went through all of that and let us know what they found in them. So this list of species was what was found in the 2018 trapping season. So that would have been from October 25th to December 15th. Those are what we found in Region 6, Tug Hill, Fisher. So as you could see, there was a whole host of different animals. There really wasn't anything that stuck out except for deer. So Fisher, they're a 5-pound Fisher is not taking down a deer, but for some of the hunters out there that are listening to this, come November, whether you process your own deer or not, there is a lot of deer carcasses on the landscape, and those Fisher are keying in on those and really making use of that as a big part of their diet. One other thing that I'll point out in here that folks may not really realize. You think of Fisher as a carnivore. The pictures we have here, one looks like a gray squirrel, the other one looks like a ruffed grouse. I was able to track an animal to a wetland and set up a camera, and she pulled a wood duck out of there. So they're feeding on those things, which some of us might think is obvious, but they really enjoy beech nuts, acorns, grapes, apples, berries as well. And as we talk about some of the results of our study, that beech nut mass crop is going to be important, especially in the Adirondacks. When you have a good beech nut crop, those Fisher are going into the winter and going into next year's breeding season a lot healthier, because they are really eating a considerable number of those beech nuts. One of the most interesting things that I found through our research with tracking Fishers as part of their diet is concerned is I tracked a female to her den tree. So females, they'll have their kits up in a tree, and in that tree there was a deer leg sticking out of it. So she must have found a carcass somewhere and dragged that deer leg up the tree into her den to feed herself and feed her kits, which I thought was pretty interesting. All right. So reproduction. I touched on some of this already, but on average, Fisher, they're going to have a litter size between 2 and 4 kits. And that could be, on the extreme cases, obviously 1 to 9, although 9, you're not going to see that very likely. On the Tug Hill area, of the females that we tracked and monitored, one female had 5, and that was the most that we got in our study. In New York State, they generally give birth around April 1st, and Fisher, along with other mustelid species, are known for this delayed implantation. So this is unique to the Fisher and these mustelid species. And this delayed implantation, I'll do my best to explain it, but so when a Fisher gives birth in April, between 5 and 10 days later, she is going to get bred for the following year already. So essentially, Fisher, they are pregnant year round. So they breed. There's a host of cells that is the start of an embryo, but that stays dormant and doesn't go into the uterus until next February. And the what happens and why that starts again is the daylight hours. Once the daylight hours get to a certain point, then that embryo isn't delayed anymore, and gestation starts. And it takes about from that time, sometimes some magical day in February, around 50 days to where they're giving birth around that April 1st time period. Once they give birth, they're not going to stay in the same tree all breeding season, or excuse me, I'm sorry, all rearing season. They're going to move their kits from tree to tree throughout the spring. And that's, obviously, if you're going in the same tree over and over again, you're leaving your scent there, you're making yourself more prone to predators. So they use this as a means to keep their kits safe. And also, the kits are getting bigger. So what we found is earlier on in the spring, their dens are super small. And that's to prevent other male fisher or other predators from getting in there. And then as the kits are getting bigger, they obviously have to look for den trees that are a little bit bigger that can accommodate those kits when they're growing. And also the movement keeps predators from guessing exactly where they are. But we use this strategy to help us identify how many kits they're having. And I'll get into that research and explain a little bit better here in a few slides. But as they move their kits from tree to tree, we are able to get pictures of them with trail cameras.
If I can break in for 1 minute, it
Yeah.
looks like the chat was accidentally disabled. So if anyone had any questions, you should be able to ask them now.
Awesome. So another part of the overall fisher and their natural history is range and movement. Everyone wants to know how far an animal goes. So this map I have on the right-hand side is from the animals that we tracked with our study on the Tug Hill. You might be obviously very familiar. Interstate 81 is on the western edge of this. Winona State Forest and Little John Wildlife Management Area are kind of right in the center where those are orange and red dots. And I have a few more slides with better maps that kind of explain a little bit more of their movement. But on average, males are going to travel further than females. And that's because males they don't mate with one female for their whole life. They're mating with multiple females. So one male is going to be in the range of a few females. And then generally a female, when she gives birth, she's just going to utilize the area that's immediately around her den tree. She can't leave her kits for so long. So naturally her home range is just going to be smaller. But there's a lot of variation to this, and I'm going to show some of the variation in successive maps that I have to show you all. There's going to be changes yearly for the same individual. There's going to be changes for adults to juveniles. And then just obviously males and females, there's some changes in home range. So this next slide will show some of that variation. So looking at this, you have these green dots and orange dots. And you'd think like, all right, maybe these are two different animals, but this is actually the same animal just 2 years in a row. The dots were recorded in a period about from February to June. The green dots are, let's see, in 2020 when this female had kits. So the dots are in the same time period, but in different years. In the green dots, she had kits. So she was really tight to that area. The next year, we caught her again, refitted her with a new GPS collar, and found that she did not have kits that year, and her range opened up and she seemed to travel a lot further, which was very interesting. I don't have an example of this, but we also had monitored 2 adult females who had kits right next to each other. And when they had kits, they were very territorial. There was like a line that you could draw in the woods, and they did not cross over into each other's territory. But when this female did not have kits, the territory kind of seemed to dissolve, which was very interesting. I'll also note that this was from February to about June, and in the if we did this from June to November, there is a chance that we would probably see a little bit of different movement as well based off of seasonal variation. So though we have some standards that we go by, the male has got a rough home range of this and the female has a rough home range of this, there is some significant variation when you're looking at the individual and what's really going on in a particular year, and if it's a juvenile or adult. So this next map is an adult male fisher. Again, for reference, you see New York 177 up there, Route 12, Winona State Forest, Little John, if you're familiar with the state lands. A little bit bigger, but still a predictable area. And then again, this is during that same February-ish to June-ish time period. And then this next slide, in comparison, if I kind of toggle back and forth from this is an adult male and this is a juvenile female, roughly the same scale of map, she went all over the place. And we found that with juvenile females, they seem to travel the furthest. And we could hypothesize about that. When the adult females do have kits, they are very territorial. When they get to the age of having kits, it would be in their best interest to be in a habitat that could support their young. So my hypothesis is that juvenile females are traveling a little bit further because they're really trying to find that habitat that's going to be ideal to them for raising young. And in addition to trying to avoid other territories of other females. Fisher, they're mustelids, so they have glands that they use to mark territories. And there was once a time in my recent life where I had time to just walk around through the woods and track fisher on my spare time. But if you track them long enough, you're going to find a stump or a rock or something that they'll pee on, and they're using that to communicate with other fisher. There's little really known about it and how they use that, and it's whatever would be super difficult to study that. But that's how they communicate. You could see that if you track them through the woods. So I have to believe this female is bouncing all over the place, just trying to find a place where she feel would be comfortable with raising young and is not going to be in the same territory of another adult female. Juvenile females are some of the fisher that disappeared on us the most in the study that we did. It's hard to say where some of them end up because some of them just disappear. Could also be equipment failure. But this,
Tim, do you want to answer a couple questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Leona asked, is it true that the only natural enemy of the porcupine is a fisher?
Yeah, that is pretty true. Yeah, fisher, they are specialized in killing porcupine and eating them. Most other species, if we see a species that has porcupine quills in it, say a coyote, we would assume that coyote might have rabies or something else going on with it, because generally they're not going to go at a porcupine. So yes, fisher are generally the only species that will prey on porcupine. And saying that though, all the animals we handled, some of them had porcupine quills, but in that, oddly enough, that study, or the stomachs that we analyzed with Finger Lakes Community College, there was there's actually more other species than porcupine. You would think like there would have been more porcupine in the stomachs or that they would have found, and they did, but I have a hunch that, yeah, though they can do it, and in some areas it might, be a considerably, huge part of their diet. I feel like they would rather go after a gray squirrel than a porcupine, but who knows? I'm not a fisher. I can only assume, but
A little easier target.
yeah.
James asked, what colors do they come in?
What colors?
Yes.
So the fisher, they're all going to be that like brownish, or they're going to have like dark brown to black legs with grizzled back, and that white patch, but it'll be very light to very dark. I mean, they're all going to be kind of that general brown to black color, and the variation is just going to be how light that brown is.
All right, and last one for now. Peggy said, I've noticed collars on the necks of some in photos. Is this a tracking method used by the DEC?
Yeah, yep, absolutely. So I'm going to touch on that in a little bit, but part of our study is that we did do this for a short period of time. We don't do this all the time. We just don't have the resources to study a particular species with collars all the time. And for us to do a study by attaching collars, it's a huge effort and usually is short lived. But for this study, yes, we did use collars to monitor the animals to collect particular information. Good.
Yep, good for now.
All right. Okay, so this is just an interactive mapper that you'll see on the right-hand side. There's a legend that has adult female with kits, a juvenile female, and a juvenile male that, to the last question that was asked, was part of the study that we used to monitor the animals, was put collars on them. Majority of them, which I'll touch on in a little bit, had GPS collars that were collecting points for us throughout the year. Most of those GPS collars that was collecting points went on adult females, but we did put a few on males to see what was going on. So hopefully this plays for you all to take a look at. So it's happening simultaneously throughout, generally between February and June, the movement of these different species. And this will just show the variability between individual fisher. You'll see the top of the map. That's a like Cobb Creek State Forest area near Copenhagen. And then the red dot that just started, that's Winona State Forest. And the blue dot, that's Winona State Forest. And this red one that's jumping around, this is a juvenile female. So she's bouncing all over she went from one edge of the Tug Hill to the other. And that little body of water she went by, that's Redfield Reservoir.
Tim, I'm going to interject with a question. So you've
Yeah.
got adult females, juvenile females, and juvenile males. Were you able to track any adult males?
Yeah, just one, and that was there was a map that I showed earlier on with I think it was blue dots, and that was an adult male, but only one. Very few adult males we were able to track with the GPS stuff. So I'll touch on it in a couple more slides, but the adult females, they had these GPS collars that we were able to collect the data that I just showed in this map. All the other animals, like if it was an adult male or a juvenile female or a juvenile male, we just put what they would call VHF collars on those. And those are, if you ever watch movies of wildlife stuff, they track animals and they put the antennas on and they're hearing beeps. That's all we could do with those VHF collars. So we were just looking at survival with them, not necessarily their movement as we could with the GPS collar. So the adult females that got GPS collars, we were monitoring them very closely. And then everything else, we would check on them about once a month. If they died or the collar was giving us a mortality signal, which when you're tracking an animal, it will go beep, beep, beep. If the animal hasn't moved in like 12 hours, the mortality signal is beep, 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 beep. And then we would go out in the field and if we were lucky enough, find it or try to find a reason for why it died.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So try to give an overview, and it's very hard for me to explain some of like the overview on the fisher without kind of explaining our study and what we did because we've learned so much from it. But now I'll just like try to really explain the study and why we did it and how we did it. And really, as we were doing this study with these GPS collars, which is limited, we are also doing a trail camera project kind of at the same time. And I'm not going to go into depth with this at all, but this is just to know that in southern and western New York, where we were able to justify a season, we did that as a result of doing a study first, setting up these trail cameras. And with the trail camera data, it's great. You could look at occupancy, like what percentage of the area does fisher occupy, or if you're lucky, try to determine abundance. So what percentage of the landscape or, fisher per square mile type of thing. But we've done that with trail cameras, and we use trail cameras a lot because, it's very expensive to track and collar animals, and the trail camera data is great. So essentially we've peppered almost all of New York State with trail cameras to help us get an understanding of fisher populations in general. The research that we do with the collars is more what is driving those populations versus just where they are. Okay, so I have alluded to this research that we did with the collars a lot so far today. And why we did the study is because in the Adirondacks, there was harvest data that we collected that suggested that population was on the decline. And with that data, we did reduce the season length to in turn reduce the overall harvest of that species, but also took on this project to understand we think that these fisher in the Adirondacks aren't doing so good. What's driving that? And why on the Tug Hill our fisher populations seem to be very robust? What are the differences? And by tracking the animals, counting the number of kits they had per female, we could hopefully see what was going on between the two populations. Okay, so first, we're just trying to look at quantify the survival rate of kits across different forest conditions. So in general, how are the kits surviving on the Tug Hill versus the Adirondacks? We are also going to investigate female space use and foraging effort during their reproduction. So all the GPS collars that we put on the fisher, generally the adult female fisher, they have activity monitor on them. So it like just gives you a 0 that it's not moving and a tick that it is moving. And we could see when that animal had kits, is she spending more time away from them in one area versus another? And if she's spending more time away, there's a greater chance of predation on those kits, you know, in the area where she's moving around a lot more. And why is she moving around a lot more? Well, maybe the habitat's not so great and she's got to spend more time foraging to support those animals. So you could see like how this is all kind of, you know, kind of linking together. Okay, and then survival. So as we are, so the DEC along with other partners, we're going out in the Tug Hill, we're going in the Central Adirondacks in the winter, we're setting live traps like your typical tomahawk trap. We put a wool in the bottom of it and we covered it, so when the animal went in there, it would kind of have its like own little cubby. It would stay out of the elements. We would immobilize the animal, put a collar on it, take some measurements, and let it go in the same location that we caught it. So those adult females are getting GPS collars that we can, you know, closer monitor them. Everything else is just getting the VHF or the beep, beep, beep collar. And with that, we'll be able to determine survival rates between all age classes of fisher. Identify what could be limiting the survival of fisher across New York. So that's going out and identifying what's killing them and or you know their survival rate, and comparing factors related to cost specific mortality. And that third one is like, you know, everybody hopes to find that out. Like you hope to, oh, the animal died, and we get to go out and find why it died. Like that's the majority of time when you go out and you're searching for an animal, you either just find the collar, you have no idea where the carcass is, or you were there like 2 weeks too late and all there's left is bones. And at that point, you can't really make a determination of why it died. So this study that we're doing between the two areas, between 2018 and 2021, we're trying to answer a lot of questions. A map of the study areas. On the right-hand side, that's the Adirondacks Region 5 area, and the blue dots is where all the captures were. And on the left-hand side, that's obviously the Tug Hill and our study area and where all the captures were. Our capture results. So in the Adirondacks, they caught 85 animals. Well, I guess 78 individuals. And on the Tug Hill, we caught 99 individuals. And some of the animals we caught, like that female I gave the example of the map, we caught her one year and caught her the next year. That's why the total was 103. And then below that is the breakdown of males and females between the two study areas. And I just want to point out a difference here, which is really kind of telling of the overall driver of the population by just looking at what we did with our collection. If you look at the Adirondacks and the juvenile numbers, so they had 10 juvenile females they caught and 11 juvenile males. If you look at our study area in the Tug Hill, we caught 34 juvenile females and 25 juvenile males. So that is a stark difference between the two study areas. And where are all the females going in the Adirondacks? They're just not surviving to adulthood. So without even knowing why, we could look at this data and be like, well, the Tug Hill study area, they have a lot more juveniles and they're surviving. Why is that? We don't know, but we know that they're surviving longer than the Central Adirondacks fisher. Okay, on the Tug Hill specifically, of the 99 animals that we monitored on the Tug Hill, 9 were still alive. So we stopped tracking in December of 2022. And at that point, there were still some out there moving around. 34 went missing or the fate was undetermined. We have no idea where they went. Could be a technology thing, like collars puke out. They get damaged somehow. Fish have a tendency to chew the antenna, so they could have chewed it, and we could have never found it. Could have went in some hole somewhere. We wouldn't have found it. We never found, like, I was really curious on if we collared an animal, it would show up like south of Syracuse, or a fisher from the Adirondacks would end up in the Tug Hill or vice versa. And that just never happened. Not saying it couldn't happen or it didn't happen, but we didn't record that. 39 died. 7 were released without a collar. And that happens because, like, sometimes we just didn't feel comfortable with collaring an individual and we wouldn't do it. Or sometimes we had to let them go because we were just overwhelmed with how many animals that we had coming in at a time. And 10 slipped collars. So fisher, they're a mustelid. They're a very streamlined body. Particularly the juvenile females, they're very good at slipping out of collars. Cause of death for the Tug Hill animals, of that 39 that died, 24 were from regulated trapping, 4 were from rodenticide poisoning, 1 from rabies, and 10 were undetermined. And that's what I talked about. You show up and you just find a collar and some hair, or you just find some bones. The one from rabies, that's that picture right there. We found her like that up in a tree. So if you end up finding any dead animals in the woods, don't touch them. You have no idea why they died. Best to leave them there. And then rodenticide poisoning, I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. And regulated trapping, I'll do the same. So the den monitoring portion of the study. So we capture the animals and then we're tracking these females. As I had mentioned before, they're moving from one den tree to a next. And when they're moving from one tree to the next, we're tracking them there early in the morning because that's when they generally were with their kits. We would identify that tree. We would put cameras around the base of the tree and get out of there. Check it the next week later. Sometimes she was still there. Sometimes she moved her kits. And when she moved her kits, we would get pictures of her moving them. So with the fisher coming down the tree or skipping through the in front of the tree there, that's her moving them. And they would move them one by one. So we would get a count that way. So we'd have to go through our photos and count how many times she moved and how many animals we had, and also kind of track that over time. So when she first started, she may have 3 or 4 animals, and by the end, maybe she had 2 young. But that was more or less the process. And we did this to about the end of June. About the end of June is when the kits are on their own power, and they use these den trees less reliably, and it's more difficult to track them. I'll check my time here. So we're almost wrapping up. So overall kit production, the results, the Central Adirondacks, they were able to capture 10 adult females, and in the Tug Hill, we were able to do 11. Looking at this, you could see why the Tug Hill population is doing a little bit better, because on average, the Adirondack females had 2.1 kits or young per female with a max of 3. And in our study area on the Tug Hill, we had 2.7 young, or we call them kits, per female with a max of 5. For our effort, though we caught 100 animals in the Tug Hill, or just about, it took 9 captures to us to get about 1 adult female that was going to have kits. So it was a lot of effort to just get 1 adult female that was going to have kits. Key findings. As you notice, there was 24 fisher in the Adirondack, or in the Tug Hill, captured or died because of regulated trapping. So overall survival on the Tug Hill is actually lower than in the Adirondacks, but is offset by higher productivity. So on the Tug Hill, an adult female is having more kits than in the Adirondacks, and the kits that she is having are surviving longer than in the Adirondacks. Rodenticide poisoning, I'm going to touch here in a second. Despite the risk of rodenticide exposure, fisher survival and productivity are higher in areas with a greater wildland-urban interface. And that's what I touched on earlier in the beginning when I was talking about habitat. Yeah, fisher need that cover. They need these wetlands that provide this cover and that habitat. But once you start getting some fragmentation, they really do well in that environment because it just provides more forage for them. So threats, I think, I got a few more slides. Threats for fisher, rodenticide. I really want to talk on this and try to drive this home to people. Because when I talked about the stomachs, we also collected livers on fisher and sent those to get analyzed for rodenticide poisoning. Where do you get rodenticide poisoning? When folks put out that picture on the right-hand side, the bait chunks, put them out in your camps or in your yards. You don't want your mice. They eat it, they run away. Good. Mouse problem solved. But those mice that are eating that are dying, and then other carnivores are eating it and collecting that rodenticide poisoning inside of them. So 4 of the animals that we had captured ended up dying of rodenticide poisoning. And of the livers that we looked at from 2018, 19, and 20, there was over like 300 livers that we tested. 83% of them had traces of rodenticide poisoning in them. So that is, like, to me, super alarming. What's difficult with this is we can't really correlate the rodenticide poisoning with ill effects of the natural history of the fisher. But rodenticide poisoning does is a blood thinner, and it's going to cause like a mouse to bleed out. With fisher, say if they get into a tussle with a porcupine or another fisher, there's a good chance that they would be more prone to dying of infection or bleeding or something if they had those levels of rodenticide poisoning in them. It doesn't necessarily bioaccumulate, so their body metabolizes it. So that also adds in some variability with it, which is tough to monitor. But it is a very alarming rate at which we see rodenticide poisoning in fisher. Another threat to fisher is just, like all wildlife species, is habitat loss. And I just showed the photos of the windmills, everything, we obviously want to be green, and that's important. But there's also effects of that as well. And, those mature trees that fisher use for denning, if they don't have that, they're not going to, they got to look elsewhere, and that's just going to limit the overall number of animals. Predators, I have this coyote here. Other states will see bobcats. Will sit at the base of den trees and pick off adult females, like what this coyote is doing. Throughout our entire study, we only saw one mortality as a result of coyotes. Other than that, there's not really many natural predators for fisher. Climate, it's hard to say, like with all wildlife species, whether it's a change in habitat or increase invasive species, could affect them as much as it would affect anything else. It's really just hard to say. It's all speculation. And then lastly, regulated harvest. No wildlife species in the current model in North American wildlife conservation has ever been cause extinction due to regulated harvest. It's our job to ensure that a harvest is sustainable. And, if there is harvest that we anticipate is causing a decline in the population, like we did in the Adirondacks, we're going to close it down or shorten it or require bag limits or something. But it's our job to ensure that a regulated harvest does not affect populations. All right. And I think we're getting almost to our allotted time, but I have just 2 more slides. Marten. So I talked about mustelids, otter, mink, weasel, but I didn't talk about marten. So marten on the Tug Hill, why not? So this photo was taken as part of that trail camera project that I showed you all on the backside of Stillwater Reservoir. But I'm going to use this map to explain this a little bit and the potential for marten to be on the Tug Hill. So this is a habitat suitability model. And models are created by making assumptions based off of data that you collect. The data that was collected to inform these models, which the modeled map are the two on the top. One is for martin and one is for fisher. The red is what's ideal for those species. So you'll see in the central Adirondacks, red is ideal for martin. On the fringes of the Adirondacks and on the Tug Hill is ideal for fisher. This model was created by looking at points on a map on where martin were harvested, which you'll see the red and black dots in the map below on the bottom. And then looking at those dots and correlating it with other factors and what is a positive correlation with that, with that overall summary of those points. And the factors that were looked at were habitat, snow load, and elevation. So martin, they prefer habitat of conifers, they prefer elevation over a certain point, and they prefer heavy snow load. So based off of those points and what those values were, you can extrapolate that information across all of the Adirondacks and the Tug Hill to assume where ideal habitat would be for martin. And you'll see that the Tug Hill does have some habitat that would be suitable for martin, not ideal, but nonetheless there. And you'll notice on the bottom map, those red dots, which are juvenile animals, which are likely juvenile dispersal, are really close to that Black River corridor or getting into the Tug Hill, where there is habitat. So could it be? Absolutely. I think it's a matter of time before martin do make their way up there. But one of the hesitations that I have is, if you notice, for martin, ideal habitat in kind of this northern Adirondack area, just east of Cary Falls Reservoir, is ideal habitat. But if you look at where martin actually are being harvested, there's very few there. And to me, I think it would be an easier jaunt for them to get there than it would be the Tug Hill. Although we do have a lot of animals down here in the Canada Lakes area, or just east of Hinckley Reservoir, that are kind of knocking on the Tug Hill's door. So it's kind of a matter of time that they get here. But how it correlates with fisher is generally fisher prey on martin. So we have a very stable, as I've explained tonight, stable, robust fisher population on the Tug Hill. Though we may have sort of the elevation, definitely the snow load, and definitely the habitat, that competition between fisher and martin may be difficult for them to get a stronghold. But nonetheless, it could really just be a matter of time before martin make their way onto the Tug Hill. We get reports. I've heard of a number of folks, say that they've seen martin on the Tug Hill. They could have. There's definitely, it could be a possibility. There could be some out there right now. But just based off of all the research that we did, all the cameras we've had on the Tug Hill, we haven't had anything as of yet. But I guess time will tell. So with that, I think we covered a lot of stuff. I urge anybody who has any questions to ask them right now with the time that we got, but this is my contact information. I am a public servant, so I do serve all of you, and part of my job is making sure you understand all the information that we're collecting and researching and the decisions that we're making. So I welcome phone calls or emails or whatever. So, if you have a burning question that we don't get to tonight, please, by all means, reach out to me.
All right, thanks, Tim. That was great. A lot of really interesting facts there. So I'll start going through some of the questions, and we'll get to as many as we can.
Yeah.
Firstly, Marty says, "What is the intention of the vocalization of a fisher?"
Yeah, absolutely. So that is so Generally, fisher are not going to make vocalizations, and usually it's a red fox or a gray fox that folks think is a fisher. They will do kind of a purring that we've heard, but they're not making loud noises. Generally, what folks hear in the woods is something else, actually.
James asked, are they nocturnal? If not, what time of day are they most active?
Absolutely. So generally, they are going to be most active, as sun is setting, as sun is coming up, and at night. But that's also variable with the females because early in the morning they were in their dens with their kits, and then early morning they were foraging. So it depends on juvenile, or whether it's a female or a male. But yeah, I guess generally at night.
Thanks. Scott said, what's their lifespan? When do juveniles become adults?
Sure. Very good question. It's actually 3 years when when a young a year, we would consider it an adult. A female is not going to give birth until she's 3 years old because of that delayed implantation that I had talked about. So she'll get born in April. She'll live a year. And then generally when she's a year old, we'll call them subadults. And she may not get bred that year as a subadult. She lives till 2 years old, then we would consider her adult, but that's the first year she's getting bred. And because of the delayed implantation, she's not getting kits until her 3rd year. So generally at year 2, we'll call them adults, both males and females, but they're not having kits until their 3rd year.
All right. Anne asked, are fisher harvested for pelts? What are the benefits to a strong fisher population?
Sure. Yeah, generally fisher are harvested for their fur, and the benefits of a strong fisher population is like anything. To me, it's the health of the overall ecosystem. Generally, you have a robust, like even with a lot of species, whether you're talking about any carnivore, whether it's fisher or coyote, if you have a strong fisher or coyote population, you also likely have a strong prey population. And those are going to be the basic drivers of those populations, is that prey base. And it just works as an overall ecosystem. And the harvest also kind of stabilizes that. I feel like harvest at a time also strengthens the overall like population drivers, because say for instance, if you have 0 harvest at all, which we could, the population is going to balance itself out. That's what it does. If humans aren't part of the equation, populations, when the population goes high, they're going to eat themselves out of house and home, and they're going to become more territorial, and they're going to have less kits, and you're going to see a kind of a fluctuation. Our harvest more or less kind of stabilizes that fluctuation.
All right, we have just a couple more. William Hunt asked, is there any population east of the Black River in the Chase LK area?
Absolutely. Yeah, fisher basically occupy every square inch more or less of New York State, other than the Lake Ontario plains, maybe around Rochester. But there's been videos and photos of fisher in Rochester suburbs, so there's most definitely a population there.
Also, Emily mentioned that the DC has a fur bearer sighting survey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Unsure if you is.
Yeah, if people like see fisher, bobcat, river otter, If they have those observations wherever they are, we collect that information on our website. I think it's kind of hidden and hard for folks to find or just realize that we have that. But if you just type into Google New York State fur bear sighting survey, you'll be prompted to that page, and you could fill your observations there, which is great information for us. But as people, you could even call me into my office and let me know that observation, and I'll log that in there.
And Emily and Katie put that link in the chat, and we'll do 2 last questions, and then we'll let everyone go.
Yep.
He asked, what is their strongest asset for survival? Sight, sound, smell?
That's a great question. That's a great question, and I've never even thought of that before.
We have stumped the presenter.
Yeah, I like you think of canines, and they're great at smelling. I've heard that folks don't really feel that fisher have great noses, and that's just speculation. I think what drives fisher populations the most and which makes them unique is that they are really opportunistic. What would be limiting to them is not having denning locations, and that is mentioned in the literature. But even on the Tug Hill, which has a kind of a younger forest than the Adirondacks, where the Adirondacks might have these larger diameter trees, which more denning locations. We all know that everyone planted sugar maples, even if those fields grew up to small trees that don't have denning locations. These sugar maples do, but just I guess what drives them, and I think that they're what makes them do well is them being able to be opportunistic as far as their prey base.
Thank you. Doug mentioned that he's seen marten along the rim of Lorraine Gulf. And then our last question, which leads into our future webinars, Philip asked, are there any interactions of note with river otters?
Interactions with what?
Of note with the river otters.
Like in fisher and river otters?
Yeah.
We have had fisher and otter on camera at our locations with our surveys, and it's just like a squaring off, like they just check each other out, and they're like, you shouldn't be here. No, I don't think you should be here, and they just kind of part their ways. But they're not competing for the same food source. They're in the same area. We have river otter and fisher all across the Tug Hill, but they're kind of on their own as far as the habitat they use and the prey that they're looking at.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and if there are any marten observations, please send them our way. We'd love to take a look at them, because with that map that I showed, it could be a matter of time where marten are there, or we only have locations or cameras that we get so far, and any information the public can provide just helps us be more understanding of what's out there.
Definitely. So with that, we're coming to a close. I definitely want to thank you, Tim. We really appreciate you making time to share this research with everyone tonight. And for all of the participants, like I mentioned in the beginning, and I apologize for the little bit of chaos we had with our technical difficulties, but there will be 3 more webinars in the following 3 months. Everyone will receive 2 follow-up emails to this. This video is being recorded, so you'll receive that by email, and then it'll also be posted on our YouTube channel. And on our website and YouTube channel, you can also find recordings of our previous webinars and the future webinars if you're not able to attend them at the time that they're occurring. And you also receive the emails inviting you to the other 3 webinars. And I think that's about it, unless Katie or Tim, you have anything to add.
Great job, Tim. That was very, very interesting. I think everybody's giving you a lot of kudos in the chat.
Oh, good deal. Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for your time. Very happy to be able to present the stuff that we're working on to everybody, especially those that are living, working, spending time around the Tug Hill.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone.